Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome to the Event Industry News podcast. My name is James Dickson, and as always, I wish you all a very good morning, afternoon, or evening, whenever or wherever you tune into today's podcast from. And I'm delighted to say, maybe not as delighted as she is joining us at this hour of the morning. I'm Monday afternoon over in the UK, and our guest today has got up maybe a little bit extra early to be ready for today's podcast. Our guest today joins us from Zoom Events and is Zoom Events head of events, Wei Li. Wei, a very warm welcome to the Event Industry News podcast. I've kept the introduction relatively short today because I want to try and get as much as possible into today's episode because it's a real privilege to have you on. First of all, thank you very much for joining us. And as people who are watching the video of today's podcast will see, is that behind Wei is the Zoom Events logo. Zoom being a brand, a name, a platform that billions of people around the world will be familiar with, and certainly every single person listening and tuning into the Event Industry News podcast will have used it at some point. But it's just over a year since Zoom launched its virtual events management solution, Zoom Events, a dedicated platform to do just that. To date, there are over 7,000 customers using the platform and currently around 150 events every day. After unveiling a host of features for Zoom Events over the last year, recent developments have seen Zoom announce a series of updates that will further simplify virtual and hybrid events, improve networking, and help organizers expand reach. And as I said, joining us today is the head of Zoom Events, Wei Li. So Wei, welcome to the podcast. Tell us a little bit, first of all, about the development and the launch of Zoom Events in summer of 2021 and how long that had been in development for.
Thanks. Thanks, James. This is Wei, and thank you for having me. And good morning, good evening, depending on where you join this podcast. For us in California, this is relatively early, and it's Monday morning. So forgive me if to begin with, I'm probably a little slow to respond here. So Zoom Events was launched initially back to summer 2021, July 23rd, 2021. So since then, we have, first of all, hosted Zoomtopia Zoom events, and we have rolled out the changes and updates and new innovations every other week. So if there's anything that you see the feedback coming from user and the customers, we tend to incorporate them pretty quickly. First of all. Now, secondly, if everyone, I'm assuming probably not everyone, let me just give a little rundown. So at the launch last year, we initially had released a feature so-called a Summit, and that is a single series event where there's no concurrency. That's at the launch. And soon after, in September 2021, we hosted a Zoomtopia. We had around more than 30,000 of virtual attendees. By the way, that event is completely virtual. So 30,000 and more than, of course, a number of registrants than that. At that time, the format and also the feature that we've used for Zoomtopia 2021 was called a conference, and that's multi-day, multi-session with the concurrencies. And with a relatively, at the time, we had some expo, but not too much of it. Now, like I said, we've been releasing features very, very quickly. Every other week, we're making the cloud deployment. So since then, we have added a lot of good features. So starting out with the Zoom webinar, and we have had this notion of a green room. And that we official name we call the backstage. So basically, it's a central place for presenters to hang out and between the sessions, and then discuss the last minute changes. And they, of course, they are safe in the back in the green room, and they can talk among each others, and they can see what's happening on the stage. Yeah.
And that was something. So sorry if I may interject there, Wei. That was something when I was reading about some of the developments that really jumped out at me as somebody who works on the production side of events. I'm often at live events liaising with the speakers backstage, and in real life you have that green room, you have that speaker lounge where your presenters will meet beforehand, exchange contact details, have a coffee, relax, talk to each other about their session. And when we jumped into the world of virtual events in for me, my first one was in the autumn of 2020. So when we were very much in lockdown still in the UK, trying to replicate and get the speaker side of things coordinated was really, really difficult. So I was really keen and interested to see that you've added that feature in, and presumably that's come from feedback you've had from users. Is that something that they see operationally as a key benefit?
Absolutely. And since the feature was released, our users are actually using that in a very creative way we did not think of it before. So even think about the watch party in the backstage, and the people staying in the backstage and they're watching what's going on in the main stage, and they can communicate it, they can talk to each other, see each other. So it's very cool. If you haven't tried it, I really encourage you to try it out. Feel it out how you can have some other creative ways of using that.
Sure. And one thing I wanted to ask on today's recording was about the roadmap for Zoom events, and whether or not there was a plan and the development of Zoom events was already in place pre-pandemic, because when it was launched, obviously August in 2001, that was 18 months on really from the pandemic beginning. Was it just coincidence that it came along at a time when people really, really needed it? Or was Zoom events something that was already on the roadmap pre-pandemic, and maybe good fortune was smiling on you?
That was excellent question. This whole thing started out as some of us, especially myself, right pandemic started, no one had expected. We were all trying to find alternative. For example, for me, going to work out, I no longer could go into the gym or studio. Yeah. So I just started finding some online alternative. That's where, when I realized that overnight, a lot of those yoga teachers and all this, they just moved their business overnight to Zoom, to my surprise. So there are a couple of them. And I realized that all of them were doing very similar thing, and that is using Zoom to teach, and then use another platform to handle the payment, and then use another platform to do the advertisement. Otherwise, how would people? And it took me 6 weeks just to get to find a right yoga teacher who would actually host that kind of a forum. So while helping those teachers and the coaches, and a lot of them gave me the feedback, and that is after they realized I was a Zoom employee, they said, oh, well, if you guys had this Zoom, why can't you just put a few things together so we don't have to go all over the places and try to stitch the solutions together? So that's when we started having introducing those notions of on Zoom.com, if people can still look into. So that was our answer in year 2020, Zoomtopia. We launched the beta on Zoom to make the small business owners who were relying on Zoom platform to host their classes. And we have the all-in-one payment system. Yes, it's a simple, but it's very functional and pretty much satisfied with the SMB used. Now, when we launched that on Zoom for the small business owners year 2020 Zoomtopia, a lot of our enterprise customers were like, okay, I see that you guys launched the event platforms for small business owners. What about us? We also need the events, and we barely even had our all hands. We barely had any in-person events. We really need a platform. So this is when we started pivoting, thinking, okay, how can we make this event platform to work for enterprise, for large customers, larger size of events, as well as a small size for small business owners. So that's when we pivoted to do the Zoom events. And we debated a lot of time whether we should have a complete public event directory or not. And it's, of course, obviously, everything is all about the prioritization. Then this is what we realized that there's so much more we can do just for events itself. And we will and besides, a lot of events are not only just external events, but a lot of internal events. So that's when we conceived the idea we should redo this one platform that can fit everyone's use cases here. So that's when in the summer year 2021, we launched Zoom events that can be tailored for all spectrum of use cases. And of course, having very robust payment system, very robust analytics, everything that small business owner would need all the way to large enterprises and for large school universities would use.
I'm curious to ask as well whether or not there was a big demand from other tech platforms for integration of Zoom into their virtual event platforms, and whether or not any of that contributed to your own desire as a business to actually develop a platform that was standalone, that wouldn't need, Zoom plugging into another platform as such, that, you would actually have everything within Zoom. Were you seeing a huge demand for that particularly in the summer of 2020?
Yes. So if you look at events, there are different formats of events really depending on the needs. So you can say that a very simple event that could be just a few people's gathering and introduce let's say the new embroidery that I just had. That's a few persons of events. Then Zoom meeting will be good enough. Yeah. Now, when you, let's say, have some sort of, okay, how can you strike the best GMAT score or SAT score for the college? And then you can imagine the number of students and parents who be coming to that kind of a seminar, probably over hundreds, and sometimes over 1,000. So this is when Zoom webinar will be best to use one single session, and with predominantly presenters giving a speech, and then the rest of people will be listening. Yeah. Now, if you want to expand that audience further beyond, say, you want 100,000 or close to 1 million of users to do it, then we can use the webinars plus the live streaming to third-party platform. Yeah. However, keep going down that path. If you have a sales kickoff, if you have a product summit, this is where you would need multiple sessions, likely within the same day. How would you schedule it? So then you will have to do the schedule one at a time and put on everyone's calendar. Okay, the first session, blah, blah, blah. The second session, blah, 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 right? So this is where the events would make sense. One single centralized place where as single clients, you can see today, here's the agenda. And you know what? Concurrently, I may even look into that. Other than this, I may just stay in the lobby to relax while everyone else might be on the session. I can chat with someone, not going into the actual session. So this is where the event makes sense. And this is how we evolved from Zoom, beginning with a single session meeting, webinar, larger audience, and then multi-session, and eventually concurrency. And then while the exciting things might be happening on the stage, and the people can still hang around in a lounge in the expo to talk about each other's. So this is how our roadmap evolved as well.
And of course, as regular listeners to this podcast will know, we've spoken to a lot of event tech providers and virtual event platforms, particularly in the last 18 months or so on the podcast, and many of them had to develop things from ground zero in terms of their programming and their coding to add new elements to them. When I was looking at the developments that Zoom Events has announced recently, and what it was first launched with back in August 21, a lot of the features, for example, like the networking feature, for example, or the Q&A functionality where an audience member could put a question to the speaker during a conference session. A lot of that struck me as something that was fundamentally already in Zoom. There was the chat function already built into Zoom Meeting. And my take on it, naively or ignorantly, is that a lot of that basis could just be adapted to then do these new things with it.
Absolutely. So earlier, James, you asked about roadmap. So perhaps I can talk about a thought process as for how we develop or evolve developing Zoom events. So typically we're looking into, and I'm getting into the network, but I want to set in a big picture so that it will be easier for people to follow. So we typically looking into these few areas. Obviously, there's a persona of event organizers, event host, and there is a persona of attendee. Yeah, and also a persona of in-person attendees and also virtual attendees. Now, for organizers, we want to make sure that the setup is super easy. How do you set up? You don't really need a professional to set up a whole event for you. Yes, in some cases, you still need an army to help you, all the logistics. But when it comes to setting up the virtual event, it shouldn't be, you need a whole army to help you out. So the setup has to be super easy, super streamlined. And the second area that we are focusing on is all about attendee experience. And you can think about how easy it is to register for the event and then to join it event. And Zoom had in this area, I think definitely has advantage. That was part of reasons why Zoom became very, very successful popular at the beginning of the pandemic. Very easy to use it, very easy to join. So this is definitely something that we continue to innovate every single day. The third area you can think of is for event host on the days off. How can they host it with the proper production tools and with the easy production tools so that they don't need the whole AV team to help them out? Of course, there are tons of tools on the market, but that is not Zoom's specialty, is how do we set it up? So that's a third area. The fourth area is what you mentioned, networking is falling into. That's what we call the engagement, interactivity. So we wanted to make sure that the virtual events, whether that's a virtual events or hybrid events, we want to bring the in-person and a virtual attendees together so that they can be engaging by doing the Q&A, polls, survey. These are standard fare of the webinar nowadays, but we did many steps further, and we can talk about the networking more. And the fifth area is all about how do you make the platform hybrid? And that is not only in-person attendees, they can networking with each other, but also the virtual attendees, they can interact with each other. And between these two groups, they can interact with each other. So it goes into even the conference room setup. So for example, so Zoom does not only have meetings and webinars, we also have Zoom rooms. We have tons of other stuff. And at Zoomtopia, you're about to hear a lot of new innovations that would help that hybrid work and also hybrid events use cases. So in the room, think about how are you going to enable the remote attendee, virtual attendee to see what's going on in that physical conference. Think about how the speakers on the stage get to see not only the people, attendees sitting in that room, but also the remote attendees, how they react to it. And we have features called the webinar reactions. And this is where you can see all the attendees in person or remote attendees, they can send their reactions and they can post their chat not only in the webinar, but as well as in Zoom lobby. And we have Zoom room set up in a special mode where it can display and roll up the chats going on the in that room as well as from remote. So these are all under the hybrid. And then in that, I talked about 5 categories. So in this hybrid, there are also other stuff. So for example, in-person attendee, how can they walk around and knowing what's going on with this event by having something in their hand? So now I'm going back to while I've set up this big roadmap and big, I should say, themes, 5 themes. Now let's go back to take a look at the fourth one I mentioned about, and that's engagement. And you talk about the networking. So we believe that the live events offer the best opportunity for people to build very meaningful connections. Nothing beats probably real-time human interactions. So now attendee, we can, and this is already released in the product, so they can set up their profiles to express themselves and kind of discover others in the what we call people directory. And then can easily making the connections through our very new matchmaking feature. So this is attendee initiated. Now, attendee, they can meet and also have a private interactions one-on-one or with a small group in one-on-one chats or some ad hoc one-on-one video calls or pre-scheduled calls and some private group chats. Now, all of this are kind of key to forming shared experiences. Now, the connections established while in the networking, it won't go away once you leave the events, nothing happens. It will actually get persisted in the event profile. And so that the attendees actually will never forget where and how they met. Now, remember, we also talked about this big ecosystem. So earlier you asked why Zoom started out the events. Events actually is not established in a complete vacuum. We are leveraging everything that Zoom has to offer from the product portfolio, from meetings, webinars, Zoom Rooms, and next is the Zoom apps I'm going to talk about. So Zoom apps basically enable the third party to be able to throw in their customized experience. And Zoom events is also beneficial from that setup. So with the Zoom apps support on meetings and webinars, event hosts can now drive and customize the networking experience for their events, not just the ones that we from Zoom events have developed. So this Zoom app gives a very powerful tool for them to be able to pull in third-party networking experience. Now, of course, I've talked a lot about the networking stuff. Don't take my words for it. I think definitely look forward to the Zoomtopia 2022, because this is where we've enabled all of those features and we showcase all of those engagement tools that we have developed.
One thing that I've noted a few things down there, Wei, but you mentioned, you used the term standard fare, and already 2 years into running virtual events, you know, we already have really a checklist of things that we see as organizers as being, you know, critical to using any sort of virtual events platform. And you're quite right to say standard fare, because it's a good way to describe what I'm getting at here. A phrase that's also sort of sends shivers down some organizers now is tech stack, where they've had these many people will be familiar with situations where you may have 4, 5, 6, 7 and beyond different tech providers, all providing a slightly different element that all have to integrate with each other in order to make your virtual or hybrid event work. You may have a dedicated video, you know, platform, something like a vMix or something like that, a different event virtual platform host, another company doing the virtual Q&A that has to plug into that. And when I was reading through and when I was looking at Zoom events, one thing that struck me was that a lot of the tech stack issues that people have had over the last couple of years are effectively eliminated by have everything that's been built by you and hosted within that one platform. And I think just from a usability point of view and user friendliness, that's going to be clearly a key feature for event organizers who don't want to have to deal with different suppliers and get them to communicate with each other to get their APIs to work and all the rest of it. Having everything in one place, to me, is a huge benefit of something like this. Without sounding like I'm, you know, about to start promoting Zoom events for a living, that was something that jumped out to me when I was reading about it and looking at it, that would be a huge selling point straight away to an organizer.
Absolutely. James, I think you've hit the nail right there. So hosting events is not about how fancy I can make the event look either colorful or even make the website look fantastic. And a lot of times, event hosts and event organizers are behind the scene. People don't see how much hard work they have to put it in. Yeah. So we at Zoom, we definitely we're very acutely aware how we should make their job easy, how they should focus on the contents, but not the technical steps. And the ease of use and also how we innovate the technology to make those things easy is something that Zoom and the Zoom events team are super passionate about. So a lot of things have gone in there. And so first of all, like I said, those whole Zoom events are not created in vacuum. We are beneficial. We take advantage of this whole Zoom product portfolio. Like I mentioned, all the way from being able to join the events from any devices, any communication mechanism you can think of, even from the phone line, from the computer devices, the laptop, and the mobile devices, all kinds of mobile devices, and as well as from browsers. So Zoom has all the products supported on all platforms. Yeah. Number two, we talk about the hybrid. Hybrid, there is the in-person rooms experience, and there's a remote experience, and the Zoom Room has bridged those two. Yeah. Now, number three, we also, last year, we had a tiny bit of acquisition. I don't know when anyone had a follow. That is Zoom OSC, Zoom ISO. So these are, think about it, these are something that is built on top of using Zoom Meeting SDK, but the ease of the use it provides is that you may not have to set up all the vMix or even some other tools sets I'm not going to mention.
Sure.
But imagine something with all of this. You may not be able to set the 100% of those feature sets, but the majority of your use case can be used just from the Zoom client itself. How cool would that be?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I've been there behind the scenes. So a lot of what you're saying, I can relate to. And the other thing that springs to mind there is the question of sort of back of house production, as I would call it. So, and this would be specifically, I suppose, no, not necessarily, actually, in a hybrid and a virtual event. So if we take a live event scenario as the example, you would have a sound engineer controlling the level of the microphones in the room. You would have maybe a lighting engineer controlling whether the stage is lit correctly, somebody else controlling the screens showing the presentation deck or the slides, whatever may be used. And having that back end control in a virtual or a hybrid setting as well. Because when we first all came onto Zoom meeting, obviously everybody was just in charge of their own audio. Some people would use their inbuilt mic on their laptop. Some people would have a USB microphone. People may be more sophisticated and have an interface with a professional quality microphone. And of course, one thing about delivering events of any kind is that you want the best output possible for your audience. So I'm keen to sort of, maybe find out a little bit more detail about the back end production. Could I, as an organizer, could I sit in the background and control audio levels, lighting, contrast, screen brightness and things like that? What sort of tools are there in the back end to simulate that live production element that you would usually have technicians operating on?
Yeah, so James, that's also another great question. And also it's an area that probably would demand many innovations along. So I'm actually not too familiar with that area. What I could share is that think of from two areas, and that is, number one, there are some of the contents you can pre-produce before the days off, and how you can bring those pre-produced contents into the real time so that you only need to focus a small section of the show.
Of course, yeah.
And then mingle them together. So this will be one of the areas that Zoom innovations would shine. Yeah. And then the other areas will be that, imagine that when the TV show host interviews a few people from all over the places, how can we bring them together in a coherent way and in the almost like professional looking production?
Yeah.
And this is something that we can help.
Yeah,
now,
absolutely.
The very particular feature that you're looking for, and how do we control the lighting and all of this, it does require quite a bit of APIs integration. So this is something that we're currently looking into, but may not be immediate to address. Why? Because there is quite a bit of the audio level, and also the depending on the hardware that you use, how bring them together, and how do you make them talk to each other. And right now, there's no good sets of standard. In tech world, we call it protocol.
Of course.
To set them up. So now, do we have some sort of a template how those things can be done? Absolutely. So we also have our events pro service team who can help showcase some of templates and helping our customers to set them up in the actual room and in the real backstage. Now we focus on around how in the virtual world, and how do we bring those pieces together, and how we can do some magic in the cloud.
Absolutely. If I may, I'm going to move on to talking about data and analytics, because this to me again is a key part of all events now, whether they be virtual or live events, is through the registration system, through touch points that you have on expo floors now, and in virtual events. You have a huge amount of data that's generated. And when we're talking about the scale at which Zoom events can now deliver events for organizers, where there are tens of thousands of people participating, the amount of data that's going to be generated in terms of the interactions, how many people watched a particular session, what questions did they ask, keywords within some of those questions. I know that the being able to dive deeper into the data and the analytics was one of the developments that's come out recently. And I was just wondering if you could maybe expand a little bit on some of those analytical elements and how they're going to benefit organizers.
Absolutely. If there's one thing that we do very well, and that is attendee engagement data. Why? Because it's actually easier to capture on the virtual online using the software apps than in person. Just imagine that in person, if you want to count how many people have entered those expo booth, much harder, right? You probably want to enforce everyone to do the QR code so that you can tell. So attendee engagement and also attendee interactiveness, the engagement metrics is something that we do very well. And we can track anywhere from how many of them have come into the lobby, event lobby, how many of them have joined certain sessions, and how long they stayed in the session, and what's some of the keywords of that session are, because then you can kind of bring together, this employee, this attendee must be interested. For example, our Zoom room offer, they might be interested in, say, some wireless security, because you can kind of deduce from the session keywords. And we can also track that in the particular session, how engaged this attendee were by looking at the number of reactions they sent, and by looking at how engaged they were doing the Q&A, asking questions, and also send out the chat, so that we can tell that what this attendee might be interested in. Now, we also have a few others, so such as we have we call the events dashboard, and then hosts can also generate the reports. And there's a sorting functionality where the host can view, can export, and can download those metrics, not only just looking at the chart, but download the reports so that they can dissect the data in any way they want. So other than the attendee information, we also have a lot of registration. Now, like registration, you can put tons of questions there, and then you can immediately collect what users and what marketing sectors they might be coming from, what they might come into this conference, coming to this events, what they are looking for, and their company size, all of this registration data that can dissect it as well. Now, we also have an expo booth, and that is where the sponsors can actually host their virtual material, as well as host an actual live speech or live presentation there. And we can also show how those attendees, for example, have clicked on your product brochure and what they're looking into, and how many of those attendees have jumped on your live presentation. Now, there are attendees who don't like any of this. They just like to lay back. So then we also capture that how long they stayed in the lobby and then watching the live streaming, as if they're watching the TV standing outside of a conference room, meaning that they're not going into the conference room, but they're just looking at the live streaming, and how long they've been watching it, and then where did they go to download some of the either speaker bio or the product information, the contents download. So tons of analytics stuff built into. Then I would say this is one of the areas that the virtual element is actually more powerful than in person, because it's so much easy. You have so much data you can dissect.
Yes.
Now we also
Sorry, I should say what's important though there is how is that's presented back to the organizer, because having thousands and thousands of strands of data and code coming out of the system is one thing, but being able to present that back to an organizer in a meaningful way that they can actually interpret and adjust their event going forward.
I'm going there.
It's really important. Sorry.
Yeah. So we have the dashboard that we believe that most of the event organizers would be interested. So we present a very quite some charts. They're organized by the area. So for example, attendee engagement, the sponsor metrics. So very easy charts and not very complex. And we deliberately chose to design that way. And then we also have a reports download this is where if you feel like all our charts are still not good enough, you can always download those reports and then do your own data analysis as well. Now, furthermore, we also support a few MAS, marketing automation system integrations. Right. So such as Marketo, Eloqua, and Pardot, and very soon Salesforce. So this is where, again, there's tons of data that you can, we actually push to those, depending on what you want, how you want us to push. And then you can completely use a third party of the MAS to, again, do the data analysis.
Yeah, and yeah, that's key for me, because I've seen good and bad examples with other providers of, you know, data and how it's presented back to the organizers. And, you know, having a few companies got blinded by having lots and lots and lots of data, forgetting the fact that because they understood it and they were able to interpret it very easily because they're a tech provider, the event organizer, who is not a tech specialist, you know, to them, 50 pages, you know, a 50-page PDF of analytics and data from the event was maybe not so good. So, you know, the development of this dashboard where people can see quickly and easily, you know, some of the key metrics from their event, I suppose, is critical going forward, because as you said, there's so much more data that gets output from virtual events than there is. And one other thing that you mentioned there is people who are maybe not interacting as much within the platform. I've heard some organizers say, well, we need to see more information about the people who are not interacting as much, why they're not interacting. To me, that's a simulation of real life, because if you were in an expo hall or a conference center, you would have certain people who come in who shake hands with 400 people over the space of 3 days and who want to talk to everybody and every sponsor and booth there. You also have people that quietly come in through registration, quietly make their way around the expo hall, pick up some information quietly and surreptitiously, and then leave. And so having people who don't interact is no different to real life, I think.
Yeah, actually, this is a great point of some of the virtual attendees. Like you said, this very symptom probably is also seen among the in-person attendees as well. And this is where all this online analytics plays a very important role. So for example, when I come in, I may not sit there, listen through the whole session for an hour. But then while I was listening, for example, I might choose to go to different places and click around. Yeah, this is something that virtual online can do very well, collecting the data, how people are actually downloading and watching, not necessarily just go into the session and do the Q&A and do the survey. Yes, they might do that, but they probably do some other things much, much more. So for example, and I, for one, I like to watch the recording that sometimes in lifetime. Why? Because it saves me time. I can speed play. I can speed play at 1.5. So 1 hour, it becomes likely 30 minutes, I can finish it. And I can also use the keyword search to find the section from the recording where I'd like to tune in. So these are some of the data. It does not mean that if an attendee did not have submitted a Q&A, or in some cases did not listen to the real-time sessions, that means that they're disengaged. No. Online has offered so many different ways for them to play. And I truly see that's one benefit of online. Like I said, like this watch recording, only pick the notion, pick the section that I like, and to me, and also being able to speed play them, I thought that was a huge time saving. Yes, there will be time that I'm coming in to interact with the people, but mostly for networking purpose.
The other thing, we're blasting through time today, and there's so much we could talk about. And I've got to sort of pick one thing that I think actually I really want to find out a bit more about that. And it was the audio transcriptions, which might seem really simple, but to me, when I read about it, I see so many applications, not just in events, but in academia, particularly. You know, if you're using the platform for, you know, 2,000 people to attend a lecture at college or in a university scenario, or something like a pharmaceutical conference where there's a huge amount of information being relayed that you might want to read back and recap on later on. The audio transcription features, I think, is something that, if it's okay, I'd like to just ask you about and maybe expand on before we wrap up today.
That may not be my domain, but I can share whatever I know about it. Go ahead.
Well, it's just that the fact that what I read about the transcriptions is the ability to actually sort of jump to desired locations of the transcript and choose to play certain elements of it, because it could be, you know, and having maybe a written transcript of a session, if I'm reading that correctly, you know, that there's a transcript would suggest that there is a written, you know, an automated sort of written transcript of it that people can then reference, you know, in writing to read back themselves as to what was said or discussed during a particular session. I just found it to be really interesting. As I said, particularly in an
Okay.
academic session, I thought it would have great applications.
Yeah, so I can share a couple of things that I know that Zoom products offer now, not only just from Zoom events. Now, of course, Zoom events are built on top of Zoom meetings and Zoom webinars. So whatever the features you see with the meetings and the webinars, they're in the Zoom events as well. And by the way, I'm also an owner of the webinar, so I know very well what
Sure.
those
Yeah.
features are that are being leveraged for Zoom events. So first of all, there is audio transcription. So what that does is that while we're talking here, if we choose to enable the audio transcription in cloud, then cloud will be doing the AI to map your, so basically this is a voice recognition, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Into the certain language. Now Zoom also has a capability to either detect the kind of the language we're talking, or there's a setting in a Zoom meeting where you can say, now I'm speaking English and I want that to be, for example, translated in Spanish. But first of all, voice recognition, it has to be able to transcribe what we say into the text.
Yes.
That's the first step. Yeah. Now, the second step is now, of course, if you want to translate that one language to another language, and there is a translation service living, and that will be able to translate from one language to another multiple languages, depending on user's choice. Yeah. So that's on the audio transcription and also the text translation. Now, how do we summarize, highlight the keywords from audio transcription? This is where in a technology we call NLP, and that's natural language processing. Yeah, so we are able to looking at the text and kind of highlight these keywords represent this whole paragraph, are the highlights of this keyword, of this paragraph. So we use the NLP technology to highlight certain keywords. Now, when user listens into the recording, remember earlier how I say I actually like to watch a recording because it saves me time. It helps me to fast track to where I'm truly interested in. I'm actually relying on that feature, and that is I search. So for example, if James, every time James mentioned events, I wanted to watch, then I can use that feature to search for events, James. Then the recording transcription, that UI would take me into that section, and that I can fast play your video and what you exactly say over there. Now, Zoom events, again, are totally leveraging all the underneath these few features. And these few features indeed are something that is a very popular among our events use. And people tend to enable the audio transcription and enable the audio transcription in the recording playback in the Zoom events lobby. And then in the actual events, enable the even ASL. I don't know whether you're familiar with the ASL, so someone speaking the sign language.
Oh, of course, yes, yeah. Assisted sign language.
ASL,
yes, of course,
yeah.
yeah.
Right. So these are, and then last year in Zoomtopia, I believe we have translated, not only we hosted in English, but at least 7 or 8 different languages.
Wow.
So we were all using our own very adapter to enable that.
Yeah, and to tie that in, you know, again to operational aspects of events now is that there is a huge push at the moment for inclusivity and making events inclusive. You know, a few years ago, just to reference the UK, we made huge steps to make sure that people with physical disabilities could get access anywhere. That there were acts brought in, the Disability Discrimination Act back in the 90s, and then developments to that to make sure that venues and physical places and spaces were accessible to people with physical disabilities. We're now seeing the whole subject of inclusivity taking a step further, and events, you know, being inclusive for people who are hard of hearing or deaf, for people who are visually impaired, you know. So all of these fantastic technological developments, a lot of which are driven by advances in artificial intelligence are fantastic, because they're also helping us meet some of these inclusivity targets that certainly here in the UK, the events industry is really keen to push the subject of inclusivity in the short term. You know, people are making changes now for their events this year, not in 5 years' time and in 10 years' time. So it's fascinating to hear about some of those subjects. We've been talking on the Event Industry News podcast today to Wei Li, who is the head of Zoom events, and it's been a genuine privilege to have somebody from Zoom on the podcast and to be able to record this via Zoom as well, which is great. And that's exactly what we're doing today. We are using the Zoom platform to record this podcast. And if I can just end on this thought, Wei Li, is that I think every single person who listens to this podcast will have used Zoom at some point. Absolutely. It's undoubted. I'll nail my colors to the mast strongly there. Everyone will have used it. A lot of those event organizers will have also explored different virtual events platforms and how to host their hybrid event or how to host their virtual event, and looked at lots of new platforms that have come to market. And maybe they didn't realize that hiding in plain sight is a platform that they're already familiar with, that they already know how to use in terms of the Zoom meeting functionality, that with just a few extra steps, they've actually got an ideal online virtual hybrid events platform sat there waiting for them, that maybe people have become blinded by looking at all of these new platforms out there, that some of them may have not realized that Zoom events even existed. It may have passed them by. So I really hope that anybody who's listening to this podcast today who already has a Zoom account, go in there and just search for Zoom events. It's what I did today before the podcast. Have a look at Zoom events and just read about it. And I guarantee you that within a few minutes, you will understand what it's about. You'll realize, wow, this has got pretty much everything that I need from an events platform, and it's all built into one space. And I think we would be pleasantly surprised by how many people go and do just that after they've listened to today's podcast, and maybe realize it was there all along. I just didn't know it. Certainly for the last year or so. So yeah, a genuine pleasure speaking to you today, Wei. Before we do wrap up and bring today's episode to a close, if people want to find out more about Zoom events, I presume it's really easy to do that, but tell us how they find you and how they get in touch.
Absolutely. So you can definitely find the Zoom events at events.zoom.us. So events plural and .zoom.us. You'll find everything about Zoom events. And so some social media, we also have some handles that you can follow at both Twitter as well as Instagram and LinkedIn. So for the first two, the handles are at Zoom at both Twitter and Instagram. Now, on internet, you can simply just search Zoom events, then you'll find everything about us. And we have a lot of good white paper as well as support articles about Zoom events. You can find out all the features that you get to see in the Zoom events. And to James' point, just try it out. I believe everyone now on your Mac, on your Windows desktop and devices, you may already have had Zoom events, Zoom clients. Try it out, and it just enabled a Zoom event license. Then you'll be able to see all the features yourself.
It's been fascinating. And as I said, it's one of those podcasts where we're well over our normal time, but that's because there's so much to talk about, and I feel that there is so much that we could have talked about as well. And it would be great to hear from you, in future with new developments. We'd love to know what new features are being added, further down the line, because like any event platform of this nature, inevitably there will be ongoing developments. You will always be getting feedback from users and from event organizers who are using the platform, and that will in turn go to sort of drive you forward.
Yes, very quickly. So November 8th and 9th, that's our annual Zoomtopia timeframe. And I will be speaking at a keynote about events and a webinar. And I'm very excited because I have a very few very exciting innovations that I'm going to share for the events and a webinar. So come to get some new information and then find out the upcoming new features from Zoomtopia.
And perhaps if we could get some information and links about Zoomtopia, we can pop that
Zoomtopia.com.
in the description. Let's go zoomtopia.com, and we'll pop a link in the description of today's episode when it goes up onto the Event Industry News website. So there'll be a link in the description as well to Zoomtopia, and anybody who's listening to this today and who wants to take this episode a little bit further in their own time, Zoomtopia will be the place to go, which is a nice way of bringing us to the end of today's episode, Wei. And maybe just a quick reminder to our followers that if you are listening to this on your audio podcast platform, thank you very much for tuning in. We hope you've enjoyed today's conversation, and please do head over to eventindustrynews.com for the latest news, features and supplements of what's going on in the events industry, both in the UK, in Europe and internationally as well, in North America, our friends in the Middle East and over in Asia. Huge event communities all around the world now, all linked up via these fantastic platforms. So please do check out eventindustrynews.com. Of course, if you are already on eventindustrynews.com and you are watching the video version of today's podcast, thank you very much for tuning in. It's a pleasure as always. And don't forget that you can get audio versions of all of our podcasts. Just go to wherever you get your podcasts from, search for the Event Industry News podcast, and you can hit subscribe, whether that's on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever else. And that brings us to the end of today's episode. Our thanks once again to Head of Zoom Events, Wei Li, for joining us early in the morning from California. Thank you very much, Wei. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you for having me.
And my name's James Dickson. This is the Event Industry News podcast, and we'll see you on the next episode. Goodbye, everybody.